When someone is introduced to a situation where age becomes the baseline for authority, especially someone considered a stranger, there is ingrained social norms that are often bluntly used without coherence. It seems a defense mechanism, and it is, but it has a consequence, and the consequence is the young person in this being forced into either conformity, blind conformity rather, or which is just leading someone along. And the consequence of that is leading someone along and along and along in a blind way, is it perpetuates the system and teaches that generation to long for being old enough to be able to stamp that blunt, blind authority of age, respect your elders as the ultimate shield of integrity. Now, if you were to conduct yourself in a private manner, a young person doesn't have to go out of their way for an older person to be at any given time judging them by the way they look, judging them by the sort of inconsistent with social norms. For example, like treating situations and reacting to people a in a coherent and logical manner based off spoken word rather than just implied word, because there's only a small amount of I suppose illumination available to one person trying to make sense of another person. The process of continuing on with that sense making mechanism leads someone astray. So they're not really, you're not really peeling back layers of who they are. You're providing more and more questioning that probably doesn't resonate. It's it's almost like that term living vicariously through someone else. Now, it's touchy because those defense mechanisms were, like I said, they were longed for, and we don't know. Like any given young person may have had a much more rough time than, like, experience and age alone isn't a proxy to hardships, suffering, and it becomes a game, doesn't it? Like a terrible game of whoever has experienced the most adversity is it's a game of that, and the older person may not necessarily be able to sort of explicitly win that particular game, but they've always got that trump card of respect your elders, which is usually not logically coherent, especially with a stranger. And there's a there's a plethora of sort of self statuses that are integrated into society that can just compound on top of someone who isn't trying to find themselves through other people. Obviously, the prescribed social framework is to find yourself through society. We can look at sort of like a giving up of your own sort of like the faith in your own self. I mean, we're highly developed creatures, anything is on this earth by now. And within us all is a natural ability to to be be able to make sense of things. We don't need a hierarchy to make sense of things. Now, some may disagree because it is a prescribed model. And a prescribed model is easily defended in someone who lives that way. The lack of questioning of these hierarchical models ends up like a sort of heavy, unexplained shield forcing compliance with the sort of lightning rod of experienced survival. So I suppose a solution is that we need to live in our own heads and evaluate ourselves. And obviously we will see like body language cues, tone cues, where other people aren't comfortable with someone just being themselves. It could be through, a sort of projected inconsistency or a projected. Some people like to play a role of a sort of, say, like a teacher role or like a advisory role, but it's usually unsolicited. We do have actual professionals who get paid in advisory roles, in teacher roles, and they have to go through a long process of qualification over years studying that particular, very precise model. Experience alone does not give context to these precise models. It just simply feels good to finally have a sort of overall shield that can defend or sort of cut away anything that's uncomfortable. But we consider that it is uncomfortable to make internal changes. It's when we sort of are confronted from a more personal angle with the defenses that we'd built up. So if we cannot confront it within our own mind, what happens is people will project that discomfort for someone else to solve as it's seen as a societal issue, not a personal shortcoming. Even the word shortcoming can be loaded if it feels like it's, like the shoe fits kind of thing, because the word itself is possibly stigmatized as just something's wrong kind of thing. But there's a lot of hypervigilance with what's wrong. The word what's wrong, if you think about those two words, what is wrong? Well, it's very vague and quite damaging. Some, like some younger people, can sort of hold that feeling of, a small, say what, discomfort, and learn from holding it on their own rather than having sort of like a surgeon like interference that has no coherent frameworking. It just it it bludgeons into obedience. So it's like breaking someone down in order to instill what is a comfortable and much more passive and less potential for that individual. Um, like a diminishing of intellectual potential through comforting someone who has, yes, likely longed for a sense of ownership and authority. So that's heavily defended. But we look today, if you look at the numbers, the average wage in most of these first world and Western first world countries, the average wage is very, very low as compared to the cost of living. In fact, in recent history, it's the lowest it's ever been compared to the cost of living. Now, some would argue not, but consider if you cannot provide proof of a certain standard of living, then that is also heavily stigmatized. And even like obtaining a well-paying job requires a financial standard. Now, before sort of trying to problem solve that instantly for me or for other people, consider that we do need those underpaid labor type workers, the working class. If we didn't have people to mow your lawn, well, you would be doing it yourself, or you would have no lawn. Now, if you wanted someone to pave your courtyard, if you want someone to lay bricks in your house, they need a labourer. They need a brickies labourer. Without the brickies labourer, someone has to do it anyway. Or you don't get the bricks laid. You get a tradesman labouring for other tradesmen. And the cost of the product goes up. Now, this backbone of society has now been called the lower class, which is another way to fortify the sort of hedging or castling of one's own private life. It feels unstable for these people who actually do have security. They still feel unstable. Now, possibly we could consider a a sort of laziness of willingness to read books now, and not just books, fantasy or autobiographies. That those books are much less valuable than books about the arts, about science, about society. A lot of people wouldn't know how to approach these books, as it's either a case of believe it wholeheartedly or deny it wholeheartedly. Now, if we consider those two opposites, they're the same thing. Believing wholeheartedly and denying wholeheartedly are just a measure of investment. They're a measure of willingness to entertain an idea. It's a willingness to learn, and the less we use it, the less realistic it seems. And then coming back to that overuse of the term respect your elders, often we can become blind to how damaging we are to younger people. Now, say we, it's you and me. We can be unaware of how damaging we are to younger people simply by defending our own position. Now, we say, oh, we have to defend our position. No, the position is out of bounds. We are seeing younger generations become more and more dissociated, becoming more and more, their life is getting more and more online rather than outside. And it's not their fault. We just, as a society, have not given them room to grow. And you can only grow properly if allowed that freedom to think for yourself. The freedom to think for yourself, and then thinking for yourself comes after being given that freedom. Unconditional as well, because any conditions that you lay out or boundaries of thought become the exact thing that is just too distasteful for the individual without subscribing to what is really a delusion. If you consider the kind of questions you would be asking someone who is delusional, we're often enforcing unknowingly those exact things that we're questioning. Now, it's always preemptive warnings that have just built up for so long that they're almost symbolized. And that letting go just seems so empty that we sort of have like this internal panic and go right back to reverting to the same behavior. And that's just within about 10 seconds that happens. And maybe we could stretch that sort of that pause out a bit longer until maybe you could be spending days, weeks, or longer in that space of allowing, because maybe we're so built up with ourselves that allowing other things to happen feels like we're allowing it to happen to us, because we built this like coherent internal reflection of the world around us that if we were to let go of the reins of the actual world around us, well, then the reflection feels like it is a direct sort of invasion where it's not. It's undoing long accumulated falsehoods. It's long accumulated bias. And respect does not mean handing over control to. In fact, the highest form of respect is having full control of yourself and then lending an ear and being sincere towards another. And we can only lead by example with these younger generations now. So the example is to act in the way that you want them to act. And they will mirror that because it feels good for them when you do that. And they will reflect upon their errors, their mistakes, because that good feeling is the compass there. But then you give them time to reflect on it. And if they want to ask you a question, they will. But you cannot reflect on something whilst also being sort of, I told you so. Not saying, you cannot reflect on something while someone is telling you, I told you so. And you could possibly see how loaded these older generations. And look, I'm not coming from a position. I will hold myself to this standard to only the degree of I don't get a feeling of some external model of norm sort of coming down on that. And we're force fed these external models of norms. We could do a safe sort of comparison there as to everyone agrees that you drive on a certain side of the road. Now, if someone's driving on the other side of the road, it does not mean they're doing it to be disobedient. It's a simple mistake, and simple mistakes seem to go heavily punished. I'll leave it there.